John Wayne was an American acting icon, and his films have influenced generations of cinephiles. However, one of those films actually led directly to his death, and the death of nearly everyone involved in the production. What was the movie and the series of bad decisions that led to the end of an icon? This is the story of the Conqueror, quite possibly the worst movie ever made, and certainly the deadliest. John Wayne is perhaps the most quintessential cowboy in cinematic history. He was the central star in dozens of the greatest films the genre had to offer, from The Searchers to True Grit. He was an American movie star of a kind that no longer exists, and his name alone could sell almost any movie to the public. Being a part of the golden age of the Hollywood studio system, Wayne appeared in over 175 films since he started acting in the mid-1920s. Starting in bit parts, he caught worldwide attention when he began landing leading roles in films like Stagecoach. By the end of World War II, Wayne was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. This was during the era when the studio system was in full effect. At that time, a group of major production companies such as MGM and Universal basically owned actors like racehorses. While these companies still exist today, the 1940s and 50s saw them at the height of their power. High-profile actors had ironclad contracts that chained them to specific studios. They were told which films to make and when, and had little to no freedom in the roles they took. Wayne was one of the few exceptions, as his star power meant that he could work with different companies on a loaned-out basis. While MGM, Universal, Disney, and even Warner Brothers all exist today in more or less the same form they did decades ago, one company had a sharp rise and grand fall. That was RKO Studios. RKO was behind some of the biggest and most expensive films of the time. While RKO had some major hits, by the 1950s it was under new management. The studio is now owned and operated by the eccentric and powerful aviation mogul Howard Hughes. Hughes was infamous in his own time, and is still a legendary figure in the history of America. The 1950s saw a changing landscape for theatrical film. Much like the streaming of today, film studios in the 50s had a new technological threat. Thanks to the television and its 3 channels, films now had to compete for people's attention. Hollywood decided to double down on what the silver screen could offer: a huge spectacle. This made the 1950s the age of the massive historical epic. Many of the studios found success in these sweeping tales of grandeur and tragedy. RKO, and specifically Howard Hughes, were looking for their own blockbuster, and settled on the story of Genghis Khan. And so The Conqueror was born. The film was put in production in 1955, with Oscar Millard writing the screenplay and Dick Powell directing. The movie was ostensibly about the rise to power of Genghis Khan in 13th century Mongolia. However, it was hard to tell by the cast. Inexplicably, the leading role of the Great Khan was given to John Wayne, who brought a thick cowboy accent to the overwrought dialogue.
Return to your people, Targatai, and speak well of the Mongols' generosity.
He was joined by a red-haired, fair-skinned Susan Hayward, who was supposed to be playing a Mongol princess. The only non-Caucasian lead actor was Pedro Armendáriz. However, he was of Mexican descent. In keeping with this American vision of an Asian warlord, they decided to film the movie stateside. The best landscape for this sweeping epic was the sprawling and rocky Utah desert. Well, by best, we mean it certainly looked the part. However, one factor made it absolutely disastrous. In fact, the choice of shooting location would prove to be a literal deadly mistake. The 1950s were not only a time of ambition for Hollywood, but also for the United States government. The Second World War brought the invention of the nuclear bomb, a powerful weapon that would linger like a dark specter over the rest of the 20th century, and the 21st for that matter. The government, along with the military, were working tirelessly to refine and improve these new weapons. Part of these improvements were regular tests of new bombs. While early tests occurred around the isolated Bikini Atoll, it proved far too costly. Eventually, they moved these tests to the far cheaper barren landscapes of the Nevada desert. The Nevada nuclear test site was in operation from 1951 to as late as 1992. During this time, there was a recorded 928 detonations of various atomic weapons. That's a jaw-dropping number. However, the vast majority of the explosions were done underground. This was to contain any potential radioactive contaminants. This was a change made in 1962, before all the tests were done out in the open, with a staggering 100+ detonations of nuclear devices. This was like a mini and highly targeted nuclear war on the sands of Nevada. The fallout wasn't contained only to that state. Downwind of this prolific test site was Utah, and the population of St. George. The residents of the town were routinely tested for thyroid cancer and other potential effects. They were also directly lied to by the government about the potentially harmful side effects, told that the exposure was minimal and harmless. The residents were steadily exposed to strong doses of radiation. The same goes for the actors and film crew that arrived to shoot The Conqueror. Most of the movie was filmed in this area, and their production turned and disturbed hundreds of pounds of dirt and soil. Teams of horse riders would kick up dust into the air, dust that was potentially loaded with radioactive fallout. This dust was breathed in by everyone from the director, film crew, down to John Wayne himself. Shooting in the Utah desert lasted for several months, until the principal photography moved to a studio lot back in Hollywood. The radioactive exposure didn't stop there. In order to recreate the landscape in a more controlled indoor setting, the production filled dump trucks full of the same radioactive soil. This soil was then moved across the desert back to the RKO studio lot. There it was laid out on the studio floor in order to recreate Utah, which was standing in for a Mongolian steppe. Wayne and the cast continued to film the movie while the loose radioactive soil was now trapped indoors with them. The Conqueror eventually wrapped after a semi-disastrous production. Outside of the potential fallout exposure, the movie also had several other problems. John Wayne hadn't rehearsed any of his sappy lines, choosing to deliver it as flatly as possible.
Yes, a guy, my father, do not desert me in this fateful hour.
Wayne had deep issues with alcoholism and spent most of his time on set completely hammered. He had asked the writer to change the dialogue to something more his speed, but gave up that request when he was told the whole script would need to be rewritten. When the film finally released in January 1956, it opened to terrible reviews. The Conqueror was quickly panned by critics for its cheesy script, unexciting action sequences, unconvincing romance, and distracting casting. Wayne was heavily criticized, with his performance called laughable and tiresome by contemporary reviewers. In fact, laughable was a recurring word when it came to the movie. It also had stiff competition, with classics like Forbidden Planet being released in the same month. Needless to say, the movie flopped, and hard. John Wayne himself would quickly recover from the embarrassment, as a few months later would see the release of The Searchers, a film he also starred in that remains a classic to this day. The world might have forgotten that The Conqueror ever happened if it weren't for the tragic consequences that began to pile up. First came the fall of RKO. After the film's release, Howard Hughes had seen the value and reputation of the formerly great movie house plummet. While RKO had once been synonymous with some of the grandest films of the 20th century, Hughes' management had caused irreparable damage to the brand. The Conqueror was one of the final nails in the coffin of the studio. Hughes was forced to sell RKO to the General Tire and Rubber Company for $25 million. Only a year later, General Tire would liquidate the studio. In 1957, RKO Pictures officially came to an end, with the brand as people knew it ceasing to exist. As if killing a studio wasn't enough, the film continued to exact a price for its production. Over the next 2 decades, a staggering number of people directly involved in shooting the movie developed serious cases of cancer. Of the roughly 220 people who worked on the film, 90 of them would develop cancer by 1980. Even by the mid-1960s, several of the main actors came down with fatal cases. The director, who had spent the majority of his time on set, developed lymphoma. He was first diagnosed in 1962 and passed away just over a year later in 1963. Wayne's co-star Pedro Armendáriz was also diagnosed with terminal cancer in 1963 and took his own life shortly after. Agnes Moorehead, who played Genghis Khan's mother, also passed away in 1973 from cancer. She hadn't been a smoker or a drinker, and her cancer diagnosis was the most anomalous among those affected. This further pointed to her and the others being exposed to radioactivity. Susan Hayward also passed away in 1973 from a metastasized tumor. She was only 57 at the time. John Wayne himself would live into his 70s, but that doesn't mean he was safe from the cancerous effects. He ended up being diagnosed with lung cancer in 1963. Wayne was a very heavy smoker, which could have led to the development of the cancer, but whatever the cause, it very nearly killed him. He was forced to have surgery to remove one of his lungs altogether. He would live a while longer until he developed stomach cancer, which led to his death in 1979. The Conqueror has never officially been ruled as the cause of death for the actors and crew involved in the production. Cancer was hardly an unusual diagnosis at the time, especially for chain-smoking and hard-drinking people like Wayne. However, there was certainly one man who fully believed that this turkey of a film was responsible for so much pain and death. That man was Howard Hughes. The Conqueror had been sort of a passion project for Hughes, who had long been involved in filmmaking. It had been on his insistence that the potentially radioactive dirt had been moved to the studio, and he had approved the filming location in the first place. Hughes had long struggled with mental health issues, including agoraphobia and OCD. Thinking he had caused the death of actors like Hayward and Armendariz reportedly racked him with guilt. By the end of his life, Hughes had sequestered himself alone in his Las Vegas penthouse, consistently naked and refusing to shave or cut his hair or nails. He would only communicate with the outside world by handwritten notes. He also became obsessed with watching the movies he had produced over and over. One of the films he would often have on repeat was The Conqueror. He would play the movie near constantly, projecting it onto a homemade screen made from a bedsheet. Was he watching it with a strong sense of guilt? For him, The Conqueror must have represented a complete failure for the once very successful mogul. The film itself was terrible and rightfully panned. It had also led to the loss of a once iconic production house, one he had bought at its height and had only diminished in value under his leadership. He must have also felt guilt about the deaths that resulted from his choices. Hughes eventually passed away in 1976, only 3 years before Wayne. What do you think of this unbelievable story of the production of a terrible movie? Do you think The Conqueror actually killed John Wayne? Leave a comment and don't forget to like and subscribe for more great videos from History Snob.